In the mid-19th century, the map of the Australian interior remained a tantalizing, terrifying blank space to the European colonists who clung tightly to the coastal fringes. By 1860, a fierce, almost jingoistic rivalry had developed between the wealthy, gold rush-fueled colony of Victoria and its comparatively modest neighbour, South Australia. Both colonies desperately sought the prestige and the potential economic windfall of being the first to successfully traverse the continent from the southern coast to the northern shores of the Gulf of Carpentaria. South Australia had already dispatched the seasoned bushman John McDouall Stewart, a man who travelled light, lived off the land, and deeply understood the unforgiving nature of the arid outback. In direct response, the Philosophical Institute of Victoria, flush with capital and civic pride, organized what was officially named the Victorian Exploring Expedition. It was an undertaking characterized not by quiet, rugged efficiency, but by spectacular, overwhelming Victorian hubris. To lead this massive enterprise, the expedition committee made a decision that would ultimately seal the tragic fate of the endeavor. They bypassed several highly experienced explorers and instead appointed Robert O'Hara Burke, a charismatic, hot-tempered Irish police superintendent with a penchant for theatricality but absolutely no practical experience in desert navigation, bushcraft, or managing a large-scale logistical operation. Burke was a man of action, driven by an intense desire for personal glory, but he entirely lacked the methodical, quiet patience required to conquer the Australian inland. His second-in-command, a young, meticulous English surveyor and meteorologist named William John Wills, possessed the vital scientific knowledge that Burke lacked. However, Wills's quiet, deferential nature meant he rarely challenged his volatile leader's erratic and often entirely illogical decisions. The preparations for the expedition were astonishing in their scale and extravagance, reflecting the immense wealth of Melbourne at the time. The committee raised a massive sum of money and imported 26 camels from India, animals specifically chosen for their ability to survive the arid interior, along with their skilled handlers. The supply list was a monument to over-preparation, bordering on the absurd. The expedition carried 2 years' worth of food, specialized veterinary medicine, rockets for signaling, an oak camp table with matching wooden stools, and even a heavy, cumbersome Chinese gong to call the men to dinner in the wilderness. When the Grand Caravan finally departed from Royal Park in Melbourne on August 20, 1860, it was witnessed by a cheering, ecstatic crowd of over 15,000 spectators. It was less a scientific expedition and more a moving military campaign, a heavy, lumbering beast utterly unsuited for the nimble, agile demands of frontier exploration. Almost immediately, the sheer physical weight of the expedition became its greatest enemy. The heavy supply wagons repeatedly bogged down in the winter mud of rural Victoria, turning what should have been a brisk march into an agonizing, morale-crushing crawl. Burke, desperately paranoid about beating his South Australian rival Stewart to the northern coast, grew increasingly frustrated by the excruciatingly slow pace. His leadership style, which was far better suited to a disciplined police barracks than a collaborative exploration team, began to fracture the unity of the men. Bitter arguments erupted over the treatment of the camels and the daily distribution of rations, leading to several key resignations and dismissals before the party had even crossed the borders of the settled farming districts. By the time the exhausted, heavily burdened caravan reached the remote pastoral outpost of Menindee on the Darling River in western New South Wales, they had taken nearly 2 months to cover a distance the mail coach routinely completed in a fraction of that time. It was at Menindee that Burke made the first of several catastrophic, fatal miscalculations. Driven by a consuming fear that Stewart might already be nearing the northern coast, Burke decided he could no longer wait for the slower wagons to catch up to the main party. He radically and dangerously divided his expedition. Leaving the bulk of his provisions and a large portion of his men at Menindee under the command of a newly promoted, highly inexperienced officer named William Wright, Burke took the fittest camels, the strongest horses, and a select group of men, including Wills, and dashed forward into the unknown. His orders to Wright were dangerously vague: wait for the remaining supplies to arrive from Melbourne and then follow them to Cooper Creek, a remote seasonal watercourse hundreds of miles further inland. With this hasty, ill-conceived division, Burke essentially severed his own vital supply line, trading the safety of his massive, well-stocked caravan for the dangerous illusion of speed. The expedition was now fractured, vulnerable, and heading straight into the merciless, baking heart of the Australian summer. By November 1860, Robert O'Hara Burke and his advance party reached the shaded banks of Cooper Creek, a vital oasis of ancient river red gums and semi-permanent waterholes situated in the parched expanse of southwestern Queensland. Here, they established Camp LXV, 65, a critical staging ground for the final push across the continent. According to Burke's hastily formulated plan at Menindee, William Wright was supposed to follow closely behind with the vital reserve supplies. However, the harsh reality of the Australian outback began to dismantle their rigid Victorian expectations. Weeks turned into an agonizing month, and the southern horizon remained completely empty. The searing summer heat intensified, with daily temperatures routinely soaring into the high 40s Celsius, baking the desolate Gibber Plains. The men suffered intensely in the oppressive environment, besieged by flies and plagued by the early, debilitating symptoms of scurvy. Unbeknownst to Burke, Wright had not even left the Darling River. He was hopelessly delayed by administrative confusion, a lack of funds, and a fundamental inability to manage the complex logistics required to move heavy supply wagons through the arid interior. As December approached, Burke's legendary impatience reached a breaking point. The fear of being beaten to the northern coast by the rival explorer John McDouall Stuart consumed his judgment entirely. Unable to endure the inactivity of waiting for Wright, Burke made his second and most catastrophic strategic error. He decided to split his already diminished party yet again. He selected William John Wills, John King, and Charles Gray to accompany him on a desperate, high-speed dash to the Gulf of Carpentaria. They took with them 6 camels, 1 horse, and provisions carefully calculated to last a mere 3 months. Burke left the remainder of the men and supplies at Cooper Creek under the command of William Bra. His parting instructions to Bra were tragically imprecise. He verbally ordered the depot commander to wait at the camp for 3, or possibly 4, months, or until the camp's provisions ran out. It was a reckless gamble built on the fragile assumption that the northern dash would be swift and unproblematic, and that Wright would eventually arrive to reinforce the camp. On December 16, 1860, Burke, Wills, King, and Gray stepped away from the relative safety of the river gums and vanished into the shimmering heat haze of the Sturt stony desert. The journey north was a brutal, relentless test of human endurance. The landscape shifted dramatically from the baked, cracking clay pans of the interior to the lush, tropical monsoonal regions of the north. They marched steadily, driving the animals to the brink of collapse, navigating entirely by Wills's meticulous but increasingly difficult astronomical observations. By February 1861, the environment turned against them in a completely different manner as they entered the height of the tropical wet season. The dry creek beds transformed into raging torrents, and the firm ground dissolved into treacherous, mosquito-infested swamps. The imported camels, perfectly adapted to the dry desert sands of Asia, were completely helpless in the deep tropical mud. They slipped, sank, and struggled, forcing the exhausted explorers to abandon the beasts temporarily and proceed on foot. Finally, on February 9, 1861, they reached the tidal reaches of the Flinders River. The water was decidedly salty, and the tidal rise clearly indicated they had crossed the continent. However, dense, impenetrable mangrove swamps completely blocked their path and their view of the open ocean. They had successfully completed the first south-to-north crossing of Australia, a monumental geographical achievement, yet they were physically denied the psychological triumph of actually seeing the sea. The victory was entirely hollow, immediately overshadowed by the terrifying reality of their geographic isolation. They were nearly 2,000 kilometers from the Cooper Creek depot, their supplies were critically low, and they were physically broken. The crushing humidity and relentless rain of the wet season had rotted their equipment and spoiled their remaining flour. Charles Gray, suffering severely from malnutrition and dysentery, began to falter rapidly. The return journey was no longer a proud expedition of scientific discovery. It devolved into a desperate, grim race against starvation. They were forced to kill and eat their pack animals, first the horse, then the weaker camels, but the lean, exhausted meat provided little nutritional value to their failing bodies. The men were suffering from advanced scurvy, their gums bleeding and their joints aching with every agonizing step. The grandly conceived Victorian Exploring Expedition had been reduced to 4 starving men staggering through a landscape that remained utterly indifferent to their suffering, completely unaware that the absolute climax of their tragedy was still waiting for them at the very place they considered their sanctuary. The grueling retreat southward from the Gulf of Carpentaria was a desperate battle against physical disintegration. As the torrential rains of the tropical north gave way once more to the baking aridity of the central desert, the expedition's fragile supply chain completely collapsed. They were surviving on the absolute margins, consuming the last of their dried meat and a scavenging diet that offered no protection against the ravages of scurvy. On April 17, 1861, the harsh conditions claimed their first casualty. Charles Gray, suffering from severe dysentery and malnutrition, collapsed and died. In a profound display of loyalty and exhausted physical effort, Burke, Wills, and King spent an entire day digging a grave to properly bury their companion. It was an honorable act, but the delay it caused would prove to be the most tragically consequential 24 hours in the history of Australian exploration. On the evening of April 21, the three surviving men, emaciated and clothed in rags, finally stumbled into the familiar clearing of Camp LXV at Cooper Creek. They expected the welcoming bark of dogs, the glow of a campfire, and the salvation of abundant provisions. Instead, they were met with an eerie, devastating silence. The depot was entirely deserted. Carved into the thick bark of a prominent river red gum was a fresh inscription: "Dig 3 feet NW April 21, 1861. Upon frantically unearthing a small wooden chest buried nearby, they discovered a small cache of flour, oatmeal, and sugar, accompanied by a letter from the depot commander, William Brahe. The message delivered a psychological blow far worse than any physical hardship. Brahe's party had departed for the Darling River that very morning. The explorers had missed their salvation by a mere 9 hours. The realization that they had been abandoned by such an impossibly narrow margin shattered the remaining morale of the expedition. While they ravenously consumed the cached food, a critical debate ensued over their next course of action. William John Wills and John King sensibly argued that they should follow Brahe's fresh tracks back toward the Darling River, believing they might eventually catch up to the heavily laden depot party. Robert O'Hara Burke, however, overruled them in his final, fatal display of misguided leadership. He reasoned that their severely weakened condition and their two remaining, exhausted camels could never survive the punishing, waterless trek back to Menindee. Instead, he made the disastrous decision to strike southwest toward the South Australian pastoral outpost of Mount Hopeless, a route he erroneously believed to be much shorter and securely watered by the Cooper Creek system. Before departing, Wills meticulously buried a letter in the cache detailing their new route and their desperate condition. Crucially, however, they failed to alter the carving on the dig tree, or leave any obvious surface signs indicating they had returned. This omission sealed their fate. When William Brahe, suffering a crisis of conscience, rode back to the Cooper Creek depot 2 weeks later to check for the explorers one last time, he saw no apparent disturbances. Assuming the cache was untouched and the men were dead, Brahe left for the final time, unknowingly abandoning his leader to the wilderness. The journey toward Mount Hopeless rapidly devolved into a slow, agonizing wandering along the fragmented, drying channels of the Cooper Creek basin. Their final pack animals perished, forcing the weakened men to carry their meager supplies on their own backs. In a desperate bid for survival, they attempted to mimic the diet of the local Yandrawanda people by gathering and consuming the spores of the Nardoo fern. However, the explorers fundamentally lacked the traditional indigenous knowledge required to properly prepare the food. They failed to roast and grind the seeds adequately, a process necessary to neutralize the toxins within the plant. Consequently, the raw Nardoo provided a false sense of fullness while actively preventing their bodies from absorbing nutrients, effectively accelerating their starvation. The Yandrawanda people, demonstrating remarkable humanity, repeatedly approached the ragged strangers, offering them fish and properly prepared Nardoo cakes. Yet Burke, driven by lingering frontier paranoia, occasionally fired his pistol to drive them away, actively severing their only true lifeline. Wills, physically unable to continue, insisted the others leave him in a deserted gunyard to seek help. He died alone, his final journal entries reflecting a remarkable calm. A few days later, Burke also succumbed to starvation, his grand ambitions silenced by the vast indifference of the outback. Only John King survived, throwing himself entirely upon the mercy of the Yandrawanda, who integrated him into their camp until a relief expedition found him in September. The tragic consequence of the Victorian Exploring Expedition was a profound national shock that shattered the romantic illusion of conquering nature through sheer hubris. The numerous relief expeditions sent to search for the missing men extensively mapped vast tracts of the continent, inadvertently achieving the geographical mastery the ill-fated explorers had sought and opening the interior to the rapid expansion of the pastoral age.